research and their perspectives on questions around the way in which identified English learner students are included and excluded in spaces within and outside of classrooms. Dr. Beatriz Arias is a senior research scientist at the Center for Applied Linguistics and emeritus professor at Arizona State University. She was a court-appointed monitor in Vasquez versus San Jose Unified, a court-appointed expert in Crawford versus LAUSD, Case versus Denver #1, and in Fisher Mendoza versus Tucson. Dr. Arias' upcoming book, Exploring Remedies for Multilingual Students in Southwest Desegregation, is forthcoming from Springer. Dr. Karen Lillie is a professor at SUNY Fredonia. Her specialization is in language policy and forensic linguistics. Her work examines connections with language and the law, language rights and reclamation, critical language policy, and language education. Dr. Lillie is currently involved in helping establish a K-12 Indigenous Language Teacher Certification with New York State's Department of Education. Thank you for joining us today to talk about this important topic, and we only have 30 minutes, so let's get right to it. So I'm going to pass to my co-facilitator, Esther de Jong.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Esther, and thank you, Dr. Arias and Dr. Lillie, for joining us today. My first question is, given that we have our theme as multilingualism without borders, what borders or barriers currently exist for multilingual learners to participate in unsegregated spaces? Who wants to start?
Well, I think I'll start, first of all, by saying that one of the first ways language learners are differentiated from other people, or separated or segregated, whichever term you'd like to use, is by the way we label them in the United States. When you look at laws, when you look at legislation, the term is limited English proficient. Oftentimes, you are seeing a shift away from that term, which is very deficit if you think about it. You're saying that somebody is limited in something, as opposed to looking at their assets, what they do have, the fact that they have another language or languages, plural, and therefore should be seen as such. But when you look at the US Department of Ed, for example, their website, or ed.gov, you can see that there's a shift a little bit away from that, which is a great thing, but it's a very recent thing. So for a long time, decades, it's been seen as limited English proficient, or non-nons was, I mean, Dr. Arias can speak to that a little bit if she'd like, but in California, I think Jeff McSwan had done some work where they were looking at how they classified children as being non-non, as if they had no language whatsoever just because they couldn't speak English. So it's really important to think about those terms and how you're labeling people. And then whatever is set at the national level then trickles down to the state level as well. And then however state policies are enacted, especially when you're talking about education policies, that's going to play out very differently in a school as well. We can also speak to the numbers. And we just want to give you a quick, if you're not familiar, just a quick overview of who we're talking about here. So when you're talking about language learners in the United States, by and large, people seem to think that a language learner is somebody who is automatically an immigrant, and that's just not true. In fact, typically language learners, especially when you're talking about schools, you're talking about children who have parents that might be immigrants, but they were actually born here in the United States. It's just that they don't know English. The top language, of course, other than English, is Spanish in the United States, but then people are often surprised to find that after that, the languages are Chinese or Vietnamese and Arabic. When you're looking at the national level breakdown, not just in schools, but in every age range across the United States. When we are talking about schools, we see the similar pattern with Spanish, but then it's going to depend on where you are. So for example, in Arizona, Spanish is very predominant. You may see some Chinese, but when you're talking about places like New York City in particular, you see a lot more European and Asian languages when you look at the demographic background of students. And then you also have to think about how people are classified based on where they are in their lives. So adults typically aren't labeled as anything unless for some reason their work decides to label them as such. It's usually children who get labeled, and children are very aware of these labels. There's a lot of research that we'll talk about later where these labels come into play and students are aware of the fact that they're different in other people's eyes from native English speakers in the United States. Usually when we talk about an English language learner in America, we're talking about students who are ages 5 to 18, and they've been assessed with some sort of proficiency test, which is also extremely problematic and would be a whole different webinar to get into today. And as I said, most of the language learners are born in the United States. We have about 5 million people who could be considered language learners in the United States. And if you looked at the states, it's typically California, Florida, Texas, New York, but we're also seeing larger numbers come in other states, especially Midwestern states that haven't seen large populations of people who don't know English. And so they are struggling in some ways in how they're implementing that in schools because they haven't had to face it before. And with that, I think that's all I'll say on that. Dr. Arias, I don't know if you want to add to that at all.
Just that we also have the term DLLs, dual language learners, which covers children, young children from the ages of 0 to 5. So within the ELL category, you actually have 2. Yeah. So I could go ahead and talk a little bit about the characteristics of where ELLs are located. The research shows us that ELLs are physically isolated in US schools. And so this is very much of concern and very important reason why we wanted to address this today, because this isolation affects their ability to learn English and to have access to high quality education. There's many reasons for this isolation. It might be enrollment patterns, attendance patterns, residential patterns, program design. But as many have pointed out, it's always been the excuse of some sort of intention to improve the English language performance of English learners that's been given as a reason for this kind of separation. However, it is very, very difficult for students to be able to acquire language if they don't have any native language peers. The best predictor of an ELL student gaining a firm mastery of English is whether or not she had a good friend who was a native speaker of English. And so without access to English speakers in classes, this is very problematic.
Thank you for sharing those insights. I wonder if I could put it back to both of you, just about sort of thinking through specifically the research that's been done on those impacts of linguistic isolation and of English learner students being in spaces where they're not interacting with other students. Well, you know, what would you want policymakers to know about what happens in those spaces and what impacts there are on students? What emerges from the research?
Yeah, so there's research from, we're talking 20 odd years or more of the negative effects that language policies can have on students in schools and others. But when we're talking about schools in particular, what we have found is that students are not just isolated in terms of access to curriculum, which can ultimately have an impact, of course, on things like graduation rates. For example, in certain states where they had really restrictive policies like California, Arizona, Massachusetts, language learners, as they got older, were being limited in the types of content that they could access. So maybe not such a big deal at elementary level, which of course I don't believe, but that's what some people would say. But then when you look at the high school levels, when they're missing out on science or social studies or math because they're stuck in English language type courses, then that affects how many credits they have in order to be able to graduate. So that was one really negative effect. But then there's also, and we didn't speak to this yet, but there was also this idea of being segregated socially from your peers as well. And I touched on that a little bit with the definition, but students would realize that they were considered language learners and they wanted to be part of that quote unquote mainstream classroom. And so they would report, in some studies that are out there, they would report these feelings of being different or being bullied because they were considered a language learner. They would report negative self-esteem. They would have issues with how they saw themselves. And yet, interestingly, they all, at least in one study, that I did, they still had positive aspirations for college. So just because they had these negative perceptions of how things were going with their schools that they were involved in, they could still see themselves very positively in the future in terms of wanting to go to college, wanting to get a better degree and move on, and almost separate themselves from how they've been classified or labeled. There's also studies, one of them was very recent by Kate Mahoney and others like Jeff McSwan, where they did a long-term study looking specifically at Arizona's policy. And the reason we keep saying Arizona is because Arizona still has a restrictive language policy. All the other states have moved away from it, but Arizona still has one. And in Mahoney's study, they did over 10 years to see the academic achievement of students. And what they found was that when you compared language learners to non-language learners, there is a huge achievement gap between them. So this idea that segregating students out in order to have a certain type of very focused English instruction is not actually helping, it's actually hurting the students. Dr. Arias, you looked like you wanted to say something. If not, I just want to backtrack for a minute, if you don't mind, Kira, to just talk to, as well as the fact that we might have isolation and linguistic isolation in schools, but there's ways to isolate language learners outside of schools as well. When we're talking about housing, when we talk about healthcare, when we talk about just access in general. And so one of the sources that you'll be linked to after this presentation is this concept of dis-citizenship. And there's resources out there that talk about this idea where, because you may or may not speak the majority language, you are precluded from being able to fully participate in society and have access to certain things. So if you think, for example, of going to a doctor's office, if you can't communicate with the staff, you may not be getting the same level of health care that you would get otherwise, right? And it's things like that. So it's important for everyone to think beyond the schools, beyond the classroom borders, to reflect on your own ideologies even, and say, how am I limiting people? How am I separating myself from them simply because we speak a different language, or they don't speak, quote unquote, my language, right? And I just wanted to point that out before we moved on.
Beatriz, let me invite you in as well. If you wanted to share anything from research studies or piggybacking on what Karen has said.
Yes, so the kind of perils of linguistic segregation we wanted to review is, the isolation and instructionally from English-speaking peers, the isolation from resources and positive role models in schools, especially support staff. One of the clear areas that are incredibly in need is teachers. Every state has, a dearth of bilingual certified teachers or teachers who know how to work with English language learners. And so the programmatic implementation is very limited. And so without any meaningful interactions with English speaking students, EL struggle in language development. And schools with high levels of poverty are also marked because they have high rates of absenteeism and teachers. So the quality of EL instruction often comes down to program implementation. And that's where we really need the support of colleges of teacher preparation. Let's see.
It's a tricky space, right? And sometimes I also think about the impact that it has not only on English language learners, but also on the other students if they're being isolated from them, right? It's a two-way street. And I don't know if you want to comment on that a little bit too, that in terms of the impact that linguistic isolation has on both sides, even, your quote unquote, your monolingual English speakers, right?
Right.
Yeah. So as you're thinking about these kind of impacts, right? So kind of understanding the importance of access to quality academic programming, the importance of having access to speakers of many different languages, if you will, including English, as well as socialization pieces. So Kind of moving to the policy part of this, right? So you kind of touched on some of the research that's out there, and thank you so much for doing that. So what are some ways that policymakers, district leaders can think about how to think about integration and segregation kind of systematically in order to avoid some of these challenges and disadvantages, but also maybe think about how can we do it differently to avoid those disadvantages. So what do we need to be thinking about in terms of policy?
Well, I think we have to crack this linguistic isolation for majority and English language learner students. And I become hopeful when I see that there's been such a wide implementation of dual language programs across the country. Now, yes, they are limited. Some are not two-way, but clearly those programs that are two-way with an integrated student population are places where each language group is hearing and listening and speaking with the other language group. And so I'm very enthused to see that there's so many dual language programs in development, and that might be one way where policymakers can start to see that they could create some positive programmatic opportunities for all students. So for all students becoming bilingual and multilingual.
And just to add on to that, just some 3 takeaways that I would have for policymakers or legislators or even teachers and educators who are working is, the first one is bilingual education. I think we can all say that that's the way forward, and it should be the way forward, especially when you position America and the rest of the world, right? We're severely lacking in that. But not all bilingual education would necessarily be on the same par as, for example, two-way bilingual instruction. When we look to the research, the models of the different types of bilingual instruction vary in terms of what might be most effective. And so I think if we can focus on two-way bilingual, we're going to see better outcomes for everybody involved, native and non-native English speakers. And that being said, it's something to keep in mind, because when schools are trying to implement things and policymakers are trying to create, for example, state policy, there's this lack of communication between the two. And so I think one of the first things that they can do is start communicating and working with each other much better than they are. Because sometimes people at the state or federal level might think, oh, bilingual education, we'll just go ahead and implement that, and not realize that there's a whole variety of ways to implement bilingual education that has different ramifications as to how you go about doing it in terms of resources, what might be most effective, et cetera. Another thing that people should keep in mind is that segregating the way you instruct language learners harms them educationally, academically, socially, emotionally. That's something to very much keep in mind, as I've already said in some of the research studies. And then research itself isn't just an ivory tower. I think a lot of times people, especially policymakers, are scared to look, they're not scared, but they don't like to necessarily look at the research, because there's this perception of academics writing for themselves or writing in this ivory tower, if you will, when really a lot of the work that's done on language policy especially is very applicable. And you look to those articles and you can see suggestions and recommendations that are made for people, for schools, for educators, for policymakers, to try to implement some of the changes that would be most beneficial based on the research that we saw. I know we can speak, for example, when we did studies in Arizona, the case Horn versus Flores was happening, and right before it went to the Supreme Court, and the lawyer on the case was trying to use our data. And unfortunately, the other side ended up subpoenaing it to try to get access to who our participants were. But that's just one example of how research can be used in a very, very applicable way. And Arias, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about how you do the work with desegregation and schools and the courts at all, but that's also an example of how research doesn't have to be this scary thing that people write about and just read. It's actually something that can be used and applied in various ways, and policymakers need to pay attention to it. They need to read it.
Even in a state like Arizona, where it is English only, the recent Fisher Mendoza desegregation case ordered dual language programs as a remedy. So this was like quite astounding and groundbreaking, because a change had to be made to the state law in order to be able to follow the federal mandate. And the judge wanted the kids to be able to access each other's languages. He was concerned with the ratio of, how many English speaking and how many non-English speaking kids would be coming together, with the view that this would help the integration of those two populations and create a more integrated environment in Tucson. And so it was quite novel to see that he mandated 5 programs. Now, 5 programs is a lot, because they go K through 6th grade. You need, certified teachers and materials and a recruitment plan, and people have to read all those things that have been written about implementing effective dual language programs. But you can see that in some places, people take from the literature and try to apply it to a desegregated setting. The same was true in San Jose. Although it was years ago, they created a strand of K-8 dual language program as a remedy of for the ELLs. And so one interesting thing of desegregation remedies is, to what extent has any remedy been designed to meet the needs of English learners or Latino students? There just hasn't been much in that area.
Yeah, great question. Great answer. Some things to prompt about. I'm looking through the questions, and we will not be able to answer all of them, but they're fascinating and great questions. And one of the kind of trends that I see within the questions is, so what if you are in a context that you cannot do a dual language program? So you are now dealing with potentially ELD teachers, mainstream teachers, and so do you have any ideas as to kind of like, how do we address students' needs legitimately, right? But at the same time, avoiding the isolation that you've been talking about. So might you talk a little bit about what does an inclusive environment look like in an English medium setting?
Yeah, I can speak right to that quickly, Dr. Arias, if you don't mind. I actually work in a predominantly rural area where bilingual education just would not happen in terms of things like resources, number of language learners, for example, in the state of New York. And what we've tried to do here, myself and my colleague Kate Mahoney, is we work with schools to either try to create a bilingual program. It's perhaps not the way we would want to do it if we did have more resources, but for example, we're working with one of the districts locally now where we're implementing it starting from the ground up. So we're trying to do something where we're bringing teachers in from outside. So not necessarily homegrown teachers, but bringing in teachers from other areas, other states. Sometimes that means finding grants, if you will, to fund things like salaries. And once we get these teachers in, we're starting with kindergarten level. So instead of trying to do the entire district, we're trying to start with what we can, right? So kindergarten, and then as the students get older, the bilingual education progresses with it. If you absolutely can't, then the next best thing would be to make sure that you don't literally isolate the students and the teachers who are working with language learners in different areas of the school. You know, a lot of times you go into these schools and you have language learners and special education often a completely different wing from every other student. And that, I mean, that's just wrong on a whole many different levels. But if we're talking about isolation in terms of access to peers and access to content, you want to keep everybody together as much as you can. Another thing you can do is co-teaching, you know, and try to have the quote unquote I don't like using that term, that's why I keep saying that. The mainstream teacher with the language learner teacher working together, making sure that you're always teaching the content with the language. You know, don't have them separate. Don't just worry about language and have content be taught by somebody else. They have to be together. I think that's about as far as I would go with that before I go off on a completely different thing.
Another approach, Karen, is in designing magnet schools. Some magnet schools have been designed as language academies. Now, they're not necessarily, you know, bilingual programs, but they're language academies, and they're trying to develop that. But I think underlying all of this is that we need to change our frame and help parents understand that bilingualism and multilingualism is an asset. and how do we build this asset for all our children and give access to all students and try to do away with as much of the deficit thinking, because some people say, I don't want my kid to be with those kids, and that's the wrong way to look at it.
Yeah, such a really good point. Another question that seems to come up in the chat is the question of newcomer schools, and maybe students who might be adolescents who may have interrupted or limited schooling opportunities. In those cases, oftentimes we establish kind of an international school, right? To kind of focus on this particular group, pull all of your resources together, and then oftentimes they are then going to another school. What's your sense about those kinds of arrangements for those students? Because it's segregation, but it's segregation with resources, right? So this is why this is such a complicated issue. But I wonder what your thoughts are around those kinds of settings.
Well, my thoughts are mixed. It is a segregation, but hopefully it is with resources. So it's not just another excuse to isolate newcomer students who people may not feel comfortable with. And I've seen it in Chicago done, with Ethiopian populations and others that have arrived, and it's for a temporary period of time. It may be a semester that it's a newcomer, and so it acts as a bridge to try to help the students acculturate to American schools. And it's not just language, but it's also cultural accommodation. I just wouldn't want that to happen, be the whole curriculum for the students.
And I second what Dr. Arias has just said. I think I've seen it happen in a couple different ways. Buffalo, for example, has an international school where it's just high schoolers. And the entrance requirements to that are that you have to be labeled a SIFE student. That's what they call it in New York. And the school itself is wonderful and it's beautiful and they have all these wonderful resources. But I have the same hesitations, that Dr. Arias has already mentioned with it. And yet at the same time, I feel like, well, it's better than where they could be, right? So it's hard to say that something is really great when you're talking. I mean, it's difficult when you're talking about newcomers. I think as long as the intent, as Dr. Arias said, is always to not segregate for a negative reason, but to segregate for a very limited time for a very specific purpose that is a positive purpose, then I think you're moving in the right direction.
And on that very powerful thought, we're going to have to close this webinar. Clearly, with all of the complexities, we have so much more to talk about. I want to thank Dr. Arias and Dr. Lillie for joining us today, and I'm going to give it to Althea to close it off formally and officially.
All right, thank you. This was very engaging. That is all we have today. I would also like to thank our four wonderful, our guest speakers, Beatriz and Karen Lillie, for sharing their insights and experience. Finally, I would like to say thank you to our audience for your questions and comments and enthusiasm around these topics. We encourage you to share what you've learned today with your colleagues, and to that end, we will be sending a recording of this webinar to you via email. You can find this event and many more resources that support multilingual learners on our website, also at www.cal.org. Please take a moment to fill out the survey. I am going to drop in the chat box, but you will also receive that in the follow-up email. And with that, thank you so much for joining us today. See you at the next one.